So last week was fellowship.
Jesus Christ.
This week is forgiveness.
Hello and welcome to A God We Could Believe In, a frank and honest look at Christianity as we find it today. We're going to be looking at the things the church says and does that are embarrassing, confusing, or even downright offensive. In other religious contexts, your questions might be forbidden, but not here. So whether you're a lifelong churchgoer with the scars to prove it, or you've never entered a church and are just interested in the debate, this is a safe space for you. In that spirit, we're diving headlong into questions of sex and relationships, covering topics from marriage and purity to sexuality and masturbation. We'll also be looking at issues of sexual relationships, abuse, gender, and identity, so listener discretion is advised. Please look after yourselves. In today's Q&A episode, we're answering your questions on our last episode, Marriage in the Bible is a Binfire. Feel free to give that a listen if you haven't already. Coming up, if the depiction of marriage in the Bible is so chaotic, then what are we supposed to do with it? Does God bring anything important to a marriage? And why don't churches seem to have anything to say to single people over 45? I'm Tim Woodson, and today I'm joined by biblical scholar Dr. Charlotte Naylor Davis, practical theologian Simon Hole, and poet, former social worker, and daughter of Simon, Rachel Hall. Okay, so here we are. We are meeting online today to discuss some of your questions on Marriage in the Bible is a Binfire, our latest episode. Charlotte, you're in Whitby for the Goth weekend.
I am in Whitby for the Goth weekend. And so if I sound gravelly, that is why.
Yeah, and you were responding to some of our messages about this from the club last night. And,
from the club last night, because there's nothing I like more than to be dancing and talking theology at the same time.
That's it. I mean, as a metal biblical scholar, fully living that.
Exactly.
Authentically.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're going to crack on and talk about what you've wanted to talk about. You, the people, want to talk about on the subject of marriage in the Bible. And we've had some great questions. The first one we are going to look at is, what does God think of polyamorous and non-monogamous relationships? Bit of a mouthful. This is in the week that Lily Allen has released a song called Non-Monogamummy.
Oh, really?
And there was some additional context to this question about kind of indigeneity and how kind of colonial context for when the gospel moved around the world and it was met with non-monogamous cultures. How does that intersect? So, Charlotte, do you want to try and address this one then?
Well, so the episode was about kind of what's in the Bible. So one of the reasons I didn't mention polyamory is it's not in the Bible. So it'd be really lovely if it was. But the Bible, when there are multiple partners in a relationship or a marriage, is polygamy. This is one man and many wives. We don't have an example in our ancient texts at all of polyamorous life, especially the way that I have polyamorous friends and the way that they do polyamory and non-monogamy, which is about consent and equality and communication and also isn't set up in law, right? And in the Bible, polygamy is a legal status that you can have, and you can have many wives, and you can also have concubines, and you can have handmaidens. These are all things you can legally have in various states of kind of the ancient Near East. So it's not there, and that's why I didn't talk about it. But I think also there's something interesting here, which is on what does God say in the question of the kind of what does God say about polyamory? Well, again, if what you're looking for is one Bible verse or a Bible story that can back up a particular type of relationship status, the whole point of the episode was to kind of say there isn't one. There isn't a place where there's just one verse that we can pull out and say this is the only model of marriage that exists in the Bible, or this is the only way it's done. I think we need to keep that in mind, really, that I don't want to be the new arbiter of what God thinks about particular relationships, but I think let's kind of take a deep breath and ask, like, what are the greater ethics we can have about it? How do we think through, this is who God is, this is what relationships are meant to be, this is what the best way of doing relationships is, how does that apply to a situation? When it comes to the indigeneity question, we're talking about something slightly different, which is how the church does mission, how the church does power, how the church does kind of control and teaching. And I think that's a bigger question that's not particularly about what I was talking about in the episode. I think we've moved into a slightly different area there. So there are two different things going on, right? Polyamory now, and then indigenous forms of relationship and culture that the church impressed its own kind of framework on top of, which was to do with lots of different things. I'm not sure I'd want to get into that today. Simon might. Here we go.
I don't want to get into it. You're going to hear this a lot this episode, in that we're going to come back to this in a future series. But if you read the Bible chronologically, then you can make an argument that the Bible seems to be heading towards monogamy. And there's one way to read that, that this is about specifically monogamy, but there's another thing going on alongside that, which is about equality. And so the relationships between men and women are becoming more equal. And what that looks like beyond the story of the Bible, I think, is open for a real discussion.
I can imagine there are people who are struggling with the nuances between polyamory and polygamy. In the sense that they mean multiple relationships formed of multiple people.
Yeah, there's quite a strong difference. So partly this is about how patriarchy works, right? So polygamy is a system that is set up specifically for one man to be able to have multiple children with multiple women. Right? That's how polygamy is set up. Modern versions of it, you'll have seen in reality programs like Sister Wives. It's that sort of Mormon kind of thing that people, I guess, laugh at a little bit. But it is set up with the idea of it's one man. And one of the reasons for that we have to be clear about is about, again, power and control. Women can have children from multiple partners, and you don't know who the father of that child is. So the way to control this is for one man to have many women. Right. And therefore, and men can continue having children into their old age, right? So again, if you want to have lots and lots of children, you can get younger and younger wives. You can have many wives. This gives you the ability to create your legacy. And we talked in the episode about kind of legacy and how control and legacy was a real factor in why people wanted to be married at all and how that works. So polygamy is very much that structure. Polyamory is, in the West anyway, is a very kind of new form of relationship. And even, I think, the polyamory that somebody, like some of my friends are involved in is not the same as different indigenous forms of polyamory across the world. So what we're really talking about, if someone says they're in a not ethical, non-monogamous relationship in the UK, for example, usually is someone who has multiple partners who all know about one another, who have negotiated the boundaries of those relationships, what intimacy is, what counts as cheating, what doesn't count as cheating. There's still notions of cheating. It's not necessarily having sex with somebody else outside of your primary partner counts as cheating, because we've had a conversation about what's consensual and what isn't. And there's a negotiation there. And the idea being, and like monogamy, not everyone's really good at it. Some people do it well, some people do it badly. But the idea being that this is about equality of partnership and discussion and consent. And we're back to those. What's interesting for me is that we keep coming back to these ideas of like consent and equality and things being open and above board versus power and control and domination. Right.
Yeah. Because the Bible doesn't talk in terms of power and control. It's just understood. It's
the backdrop. Yeah.
So when we're trying to map on these concepts, the assumptions in the Bible are not our assumptions. And we're trying to use one loaded text to map onto a completely different context with a whole 2,000 years worth of history, which, again, not to prefigure something, but that will be our subject of the next episode.
Yeah.
It's worth just remembering when Jesus talks about divorce, he's talking specifically to men because only men could divorce their wives. So he's basically saying you cannot divorce your wife because she burns your dinner. You cannot divorce your wife because she displeases you. You can only divorce your wife if something has seriously broken down the covenant of that relationship, i.e. in that context, sexual infidelity. And I think that's really important. I think it's really, really wrong to apply that now to, as it is often applied to, a woman in an abusive relationship. because Jesus was specifically speaking into this hierarchical, controlling context in which women belonged to men. And Jesus is trying to bring some equality of rights into marriage at that time by saying, men, you cannot treat women like disposable objects. You have to treat them as an equal partner in your marriage.
It's interesting. So you've brought up Genesis, and I did think one of the queries was, I didn't mention Genesis. I didn't. I was thinking, like, why didn't I mention Genesis? I didn't mention Genesis because I don't read the Genesis account as a text on marriage. So that's one of the reasons that I didn't do it.
So by that we mean, Adam, the first human.
Yeah.
And then wife created Eve as a companion.
And then he knew her, and what people do is they go, and that was a marriage. And therefore, anytime you have sex with somebody, you're marrying them. Like, that is a basis. And I realised I didn't mention it, and people do use that. And I think probably Rachel and I probably both heard that sort of thing when we were growing up, which is this sort of like, well, if you've had sex with someone, you've essentially married them, because Adam and Eve had sex and they were then married before there was a marriage certificate. Having sex counts as being married. And I realised I didn't mention it because in my head, I don't think that's what the Genesis text is about. So from a biblical scholarly point of view, I don't think the Genesis text in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 is at all a marriage text. I don't think anybody in pretty much until probably the Second Temple period is reading it as that. I say that because even in Genesis, we very quickly get to polygamy. So we very quickly get to a situation where we aren't talking about one man and one woman again.
Yeah,
so
because in the Genesis text, there's that almost like editorial note. You get the story of Adam and Eve, and then there's like this like one line, and it's like, and therefore that is why a man will leave his mother or father and become joined with his wife. Yeah. And it's like, it reads really weirdly in the context because it's otherwise poetry, and suddenly you've got this like footnote.
Yeah. And it exists as a kind of, one of the things with Genesis is always what question is it answering? I talked about that a little bit, of kind of thinking about what is a text answering. And it is giving a sort of like, and therefore that's why we're in love. That's why we fall for one another. The Genesis text is a kind of like, how are we in this mess where genders always are doing this stuff? And it's like, well, because look, originally you were one human. The human was created, and then you were split into two types of human, but that's why you'll always want to be back together. Great. Right. When Jesus uses it, when Matthew has Jesus use it, so again, I'm going to be biblical scholarly about this instead of too theological. When our gospel writers have Jesus use that text, they are doing an interpretation of that text.
Okay.
I know we like to think that Jesus is the ultimate interpreter of text, but we have gospel writers who, in their new Second Temple Judaism context, where divorce is very different from, say, it is in Genesis, or it is in the book of Ruth, or it is in the book of Judges, or it is in the book of, all of those examples that I showed. Now we have a gospel writer wanting to explain why we're going to go for monogamy. And what we're in, as I said last time, is now in a period where monogamy is held up as a much more important thing. It's still patriarchal. It's still men that decide who marries, who doesn't, who divorces, who doesn't. And our gospel writers bring in this verse to say, you can't just, as Simon said, leave your wives. So I think I didn't mention it because I was like, in my head, it's not one of the texts of marriage.
Right, okay.
But it is pulled out as a kind of like, and therefore sex and marriage are essentially the same. But I don't...
Yeah,
I don't think that's what Genesis... For me, anyway, that's not how I read Genesis as a text. It's not the question it was answering, so...
No, that's true. But it's like, this is where how it's used today definitely feels like that is like the foundation text for what we were talking about, the biblical doctrine of marriage. That seems like... Yeah. Because it's on page 1.
It's on page,
pretty much.
Right.
It's on page that thing is on, and so I think people then take that and go, right, well, it's central, and
yeah. I think what's interesting about the way that we use these things, though, as well, is it's not that I think that the Bible has nothing to say about what marriage is or isn't, but it's interesting that people will say that the Bible's clear, and then maybe they'll pick up Genesis, and then they'll ignore the entirety of the Old Testament and then pick up at Matthew, right? But then if we want to talk about divorce or homosexual relationships or different types of gender, suddenly we care about Deuteronomy again. Suddenly we really care about the book of Ruth. Suddenly it's like, okay, so when we're criticizing one type of relationship, Leviticus is really important. But when I go, well, maybe there's loads of different models of marriage in the Bible, people go, no, there's Genesis where two people get married, and there's Matthew 19 where two people get married, and it's monogamy. And you're like, we can't do this, right? We've got to be at least honest. It's not wrong to construct a biblical theology of marriage using those verses, but we have to be honest that that isn't the only thing that exists in our text. And that's not, the text is not pure in that way. It's not stable in that way, I guess.
So I guess that sort of leads quite nicely onto another question we had, which was, if there are all these different versions of marriage in the Bible, how do we choose one? So go on, take your
Simon.
pick.
I'm going to move to the established minister in the room.
Well, I have this friend, and when I was a minister in a great church in North Leeds, she came and did a session with the young people. She's called Charlotte Naylor Davis.
What?
And the young people said, are there any verses that speak to LGBTQ plus people? And she said, yes, all of them. So I think the answer to the question about, like, how do we work out what a good Christian marriage is the same question as, like, how do we work out how to treat our neighbour, or what is a good Christian business deal. I think if we just take out these different verses that seem to be specifically about marriages, we're missing the thrust of what it means to be godlike. So for me, that's a problem. Because I think, as I was saying in the episode, most of these stories are just stories. Again, we're going to come to this later, but the Bible was not written as a moral manual for us. And therefore, what we do when we try to turn it into that is a kind of violence to the text. We're wringing something out of it that, if we're not careful, just it isn't there. And so there's a broader stream of what it means to be like God. And in the Orthodox tradition, they have a word for that, which is theosis, that our purpose is to become godlike. And so the question is, how do we become godlike or Christ-like in our sexual relationships?
Well, I was just going to add that I found that really confusing as a child, like the idea of stories in the Bible, but then kind of in the same breath, this idea of like a manual of like, and that was just my understanding of it as a kid, but like, learning stories in Sunday school, but never really knowing whether I thought they were true or not. And I found that like really confusing and was like, well, do I really believe that somebody, survived in the body of a whale, but you're told that like, we believe that God is real, and this kind of mix of kind of fiction and poetry and kind of stuff that we believe to be true, but isn't necessarily fact. Like, I think when we're thinking about our interpretation of the Bible, like I just found that endlessly confusing. I didn't know, and still really to this day, like how to take it, of like, well, if this is a fictional story, but we believe that like real people wrote it, like I still find that incredibly confusing.
I think it is. I think that's not always helpful, is it? Me just going, it is really confusing. But I think Simon is right. Like, when it comes to how we use the Bible, what we need to be, and when it comes to something like ethics and morals and kind of rules for them, and we are talking about sex and relationships, and a lot of the questions that we're getting seem to be very kind of like, but what is the rule then? If it's not this rule, what's the next rule? Like, where's the next rule? And I think we have to be honest that what we're really talking about is a more complex approach to faith and a more complex approach to religion, and being a bit more honest in our churches, maybe, that we've all been negotiating with the Bible all along. Like, let's stop pretending that we don't negotiate with this text, that we don't use it in multiple ways, and trusting people as well, right? I've re-listened to the episodes as they've been coming out, which is a special type of hell for me, but I feel like I need to remember what I said. But what comes out for me is particularly in kind of our conversations in the first 2 episodes is that there's a sort of fear that we had, or that was instilled in us, that if we got this wrong, God somehow is so punitive that that's the end of everything. So instead of embracing questioning and space, and on our leaders being honest and saying, oh, you know what, it's really hard to understand quite what the Bible means, let's work out together where we sit with this, we give people rules and we give people just really straight lines because we're afraid, and then we get afraid. So then when we're starting to deconstruct, we're even more afraid, because what if we're deconstructing ourselves out of grace, I guess?
I was going to say, it's like the irony of like we're all actually acting out of a place of fear when the like root of Christianity is love. Like it's a really ironic thing that we're all kind of tiptoeing around. Even just the concept of, you know, if we do X, Y, Z, then we're a terrible person. And, you know, the focus is, or what if I do all these really lovely things to help my neighbor? Or what if I act in this way? And like, you know, in the kind of striving to be a better person, we're actually all just getting ourselves like tangled up.
Yeah. And I think there's something isn't in there of like, I was told that I was supposed to have a relationship with God, but then somehow there's these just like hard lines inside of it that can't be moved, which isn't like any relationship I've ever had. I've literally never had a relationship with anyone in my life where there are just these lines that never grow, especially people I've been, you know, if I think about my relationship with my parents, it'd be really weird if we were still working on the rules I had when I was 2. Now that I'm 47, it would be madness to be doing that. We've negotiated them. The relationship is still there. My dad is still my dad. He still has a certain amount of like power and authority in my life, but not in the way he did when I was a child. And it's a really strange thing that we don't embrace this kind of an idea that we can grow and negotiate and love and still have God as an authority. And I'm sure some people listening have thought that I'm kind of particularly throwing out the authority of the Bible, but I take the Bible really seriously, but I have a negotiation with it that's different and is growing and is movable, you know?
So we've had another question, which perhaps ties into some of the stuff that, in particular, Simon was saying. The question is, if God is real, do you believe he adds something special to a marriage? Wouldn't we expect him to be reflected in the union between man and wife?
I think I've just said what I would say to that question.
Sure, okay.
In the sense that I don't think there's anything objectively different between a Christian marriage and any other kind of committed relationship. Not sort of at the ontological level, if you want to get all philosophical. I think later in this series we're going to get to the idea of covenant, which is a word that we just don't really use, and it's very important to the people that write the Bible, but it's not very important to us, which makes it a very slippery word to use. But I'm going to just put that to one side. I just think if you are someone who is seeking God's help to become a more generous and less egocentric person, then yeah, that's definitely going to bring something special to a marriage. I don't think that's exclusive to Christians, but hopefully every Christian is working really hard at decentering their ego and living for the sake of those around them.
Because, I mean, I guess like baked into the question, though, is the sort of like, I mean, obviously we are talking about marriage. We have singling out marriage as a thing to talk about, but because it's held up as the primary state. Is like the default mode, the absolute goal. And I think it's difficult to discuss this without also saying, I mean, what you're talking about, Simon, is deriving a principle for understanding marriage. It's not taking words in the Bible and applying them literally. It's going, what is God's character? What does that mean for my marriage? What does that mean for my relationships? And if that's the case, then there's no reason there should be any sort of exceptionalism, because this should apply to all the relationships that you're in, everything that you do. I think if that's the route you're going down, you're trying to become a more godlike in that. If that's the goal, I think perhaps there are some passages in the Bible which maybe do they support this exceptionalism?
I think it works the other way. I don't think I have discovered any passages in the scripture that indicate that marriage is something specific to religious people. I think all of the stuff that compare God and marriage works the other way. It's much more the scripture goes, you know, when you're in a marriage and it's really good, then that's what our relationship with God is like when it's really good. And when you're in a marriage and it goes really, really bad, that's what it's like when our relationship with God goes really, really bad. I believe, and we've talked about Genesis, and we could talk about Genesis for hours. I agree with Charlotte. I don't think that Genesis is instituting marriage because it just sort of happens. And I think that's the thing. I think the Bible shows that marriage is a natural state for human beings to be in, and that God can be revealed in that, as God can be revealed in all sorts of good things in creation. I don't think that God institutes it as a sacrament, for example, in the sense of my people are going to do this special thing that is a religious thing. I think it's like, this is how human beings live. And in that, God can be revealed. And in that, we can live more towards being like God. So I don't think, as we're going to talk about in the next episode, we'll see that for the first 800 to 1,000 years, the church didn't think of marriage as a specifically religious institution. It was another contract. It was another business deal that was going on in society.
Yeah.
And yes, the church had views about how you should enter into that contract, but it wasn't a thing that the church felt was a specifically religious institution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the questioner has specifically referenced a couple of things like the three-chord strand is not easily broken, as in that in a marriage there are three of you. There is you and your spouse and God, and that it gives you a particularly unique strength. And so from what you've said there, Simon, are you sort of saying that's perhaps a principle that applies not only to marriage, but just generally to relationships where there is an understanding of God?
Yeah, this is actually a verse from Ecclesiastes.
Okay.
And as far as I know, it's not specifically about marriage in its original context. It's just about friendship. It's about companionship. And it might be that the three is actually, the third character's not even God. It's about being in a gang is really cool. You keep safe, you keep warm, you keep, you can help each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one that we use in marriage ceremonies because it's a lovely metaphor for two people and God. It's a lovely metaphor, but it isn't what the writer in Ecclesiastes is talking about. What's joyous about that a little bit is this is a perfect example of how theology works. As Simon was saying, we take lots and lots of things that are about who God is in different ways and we apply them to a marriage, but they're not definitive. And I think that exceptionalism thing's really interesting because none of our writers, including Paul, so when we think about Ephesians 5, which I talked about quite a bit, which is the household codes, Paul is not instituting a new rule of marriage in Ephesians 5. Again, I've said Paul, I'm not sure Paul wrote Ephesians. It doesn't really matter because it's in the canon. But both Ephesians 5 and Colossians are a Pauline commentary on the world that those people live in already and the marriages they are already doing and the houses that they already run. They are not a magical novel setup of a new thing. So what they are doing is saying, if we believe that Christ is who Christ says, who we think Christ is, and we now are in this relationship where you can access God at all times, if, the resurrection happened, if all of these things are what we believe is true, then how do we put that into place in our homes? Now, that's a question we can all ask ourselves all the time. And as Simon said, in any relationship we're in, Paul in 1 Corinthians is quite clear that actually marriage is a concession for keeping you sexually moral. But really what you should be doing is being single because that's the way you dedicate yourself to the Lord. What we've done is we've made an idol of marriage. We really have. We've made marriage the kind of ultimate way that you're supposed to serve God. And that's really helpful because as a woman, you then get put into a category of mother and homemaker, right? So there's a patriarchal element to us raising up marriage. I mean, the Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr and her new book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, lay this out in a historical context really well. That there is a element of raising up marriage in the 20th century particularly as the ideal way to serve God means that women get put back into the home in evangelicalism and put back into that place of like, you're not a leader, you're not out in the world, because marriage and motherhood are the ultimate way of being a woman. woman. Men get to have marriage and all the other things that come with life, but we're getting... So we need to address that a little bit. But in our texts, these are commentaries on what is already happening. They aren't the establishment of something mad, like new, novel, and purely Christian. They're a Christian version of what is there already. That does mean that God brings something to a marriage. I think our biblical writers are going, God brings something to everything. You want Christ to be in all of your life. You know, Paul's going to talk about where Christ is in the way you cut your hair, in the way you wear your clothes, in the way you go to market, literally in Corinthians, particularly in 1 Corinthians, it's like, last week you weren't in Christ. Now you are in Christ. Everything you do is different because you are in Christ. So absolutely, there is something about being in Christ that brings a different dimension to what you're doing. But it's not as clear as, therefore, Christian marriages will always be the best marriages, or Christian marriage is this sanctified thing.
It's just worth remembering where we started the last episode, which is that we've inherited a particular idea of what a good Christian life is. And it definitely involves meeting someone at university, getting married, what is now quite young in our culture, having children. And we can 100% say you cannot find that in the Bible.
Right.
So what is presented to us as biblical marriage just isn't there. And therefore, I'm not saying it's not a way of working out what's there, but it is just a way of working out what's there in our context. So please don't keep calling it biblical marriage, because it's something that's been negotiated within evangelicalism and prioritized, as Charlotte says, way beyond anything that could truly be called biblical. Because certainly early Paul thinks marriage is a bit of a distraction from trying to preach the gospel to as many people as possible before Jesus comes back.
Yeah, next Tuesday. One of the questions that I got, and we probably could talk about this in a later episode because it's not specifically about kind of marriage in the Bible, but was like, why did churches not talk about anything about being single kind of over 45? And I really felt for my friend that asked it, because it's true, right? We have prioritized marriage in a particular way that means that if you are not married and you are older, you're basically invisible. We've got loads of things to say to young people about sex and relationships, but literally nothing to say to people who are older. There's an assumption that you either have been called to celibacy, which I definitely have not been, or you are, or that you're just happy, or that you're just sort of too far gone for us to really have anything to say, because, you know, we don't want to address, and we are going to talk about that actually in a few weeks' time, so I guess probably we should leave it here, but like, because we don't prioritize any idea of pleasure and sex being something that is a natural part of your life rather than something to suppress, there's a kind of like, well, you're over, you know, you're just sort of old and single now, tough, wither away, off you go, you know. But it is part of that, when we say like you've elevated marriage to this sort of idol, it's like, yeah, so much so that we seem to have nothing to say to people if they aren't living this one particular way of doing it.
And we've said this before, but I'll say it again, we're not anti-marriage at all.
No.
We are, I mean, two of us are very happily married, and Charlotte, I don't think you don't look back on your marriage in negative terms.
No, not at all. I just did my first wedding. I just officiated my first wedding a couple of weeks ago, and if I were anti-marriage, I would not have said the lovely things I said.
Sure.
A couple of our questions have been very sort of, like, say, what is the new rule? I would encourage people, if you're listening and you've been listening this far, to keep listening. Like, we've constructed the series, so we're on a journey, right, from here's some of the mess through why the mess might have happened to where some of us are now. But we aren't trying to lay down the new rules. We're trying to figure out some of the stuff that we're all living with and that our friends are living with and that we're living in. So we're not trying to lay down a new ethic or be the new arbiters of what God says marriage and sex are like.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure it out together.
Rachel, has that thrown up any questions or observations?
It's a good question. I mean, I was thinking about going back to what Dad was saying about kind of the ideal is that you meet somebody at university and then you get married really young and then that's sort of it. And have been in a long-term relationship kind of through those years of my early 20s, and it's been interesting pushing against the expectation of other people that because me and my partner have been in and around church, that would be the decision that we would also make. And people ask us still, like I went to a party last week and saw people from school and they were like, when are you getting married? And we're like, not anytime soon. And I'm trying to figure out why that's the choice that we're making. Partly it's like weddings are really expensive, but there's also something in me that's like, you know, marriage is patriarchal. It is. I have issue with it as much as I love it. And like, I was at a wedding on Friday. Like, I love weddings. I spoke at this wedding. I read a poem. Like, I think marriage is great, but there's also issue that I take with it. And yeah, I was just thinking it's just interesting that because I have any sort of connection with church, there's just an assumption that that would be the choice that we would make is, you know, as soon as we were 21, we would get married. And I have friends that made that decision and they're still happily married and, you know, they have children and there's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to take the time to question it rather than just doing it because it was an expectation. And it's interesting hearing you guys talking about like, this isn't actually like, you know, what we describe as biblical marriage. It's not actually this, like this thing that has kind of almost been pushed at me by other people. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, totally. And like me and Lisa were together for 4 years before we got married, sort of engaged for about 15 months. And that was odd in our circle to have been together that long for that. And then I think, you know, like when we got married, I think we really felt a lot of that patriarchal weight. And so, you know, when we were deciding what to do with names and everything, in the end, we didn't, at least I didn't take my name. We combined surnames. Just, you know, and that doesn't work for everyone. But I think that was a really interesting process that I really appreciated in just evaluating what is this cultural assumption that I've grown up with and how does it make me feel as the man to think to take on some of that weight that women have always seem to have had to do, where you suddenly you lose your name and your identity and you have to form this new thing. And I think I was really kind of proud of that we were able to find a new expression of it that made sense to us. But, you know, we definitely felt the pressure to just go along with what was the norm.
I literally had this conversation the other day. Like, my partner was talking about the fact that his male cousin has had a child and the child has mum's name because they're not married. And that, like, mum was like, if, you know, we're not married, I want the child to have my name. And Alfie was like, that means that I'm the only person that, like, I'm the only male cousin left to carry on, like, my family name. And it was this really interesting conversation of like, oh, is that automatically what's going to happen then? You know, like, you know, questioning. And look, I don't know the answer, but it's just funny that, you know, we all still, you know, like, have this kind of understanding that that's just the way that it goes, and we don't actually stop to question it.
I think it's funny. I mean, I'm Naylor Davis, and I wasn't born Naylor Davis. I'm Charlotte Naylor is me, and Davis is my ex-husband, right? So it's really funny that when people start saying, well, I don't think I will take your name, men will often still, and, you know, it was a conversation we had that was like, yeah, but then will people know that we're the same person? And yeah, what if we have children? Will they have my name? It's like, okay, so you can appreciate that the name is important to you, but it's somehow not meant to be important to women. And I was very like, yeah, well, my name represents my dad, and I don't have a middle name. So as well, I was a bit like, I don't know who Charlotte Davis is. Who the hell is she? Like, I've got no middle name to carry on. So we're just creating a new person. So in the end, we became Naylor Davis. Annoying, without a hyphen, it's caused all sorts of problems. What a foolish thing I did. But I remember my mum saying to me when I was a teenager that she wished she'd known she could keep her name because she liked her name and she didn't know that she could. And then later on was like, oh, hang on a minute, that would have been a really nice thing to do. And but it is funny because there's this, like, say, there's this sort of, oh, but what if my child doesn't have my name? And you're like, well, what if it doesn't have the woman's name? Like, we're all allowed to be attached to our names, actually.
It's interesting,
strange
as well, that I think the name element of it, like, signifies a level of ownership, like,
legacy.
Particularly with a child, like, this child belongs to this person. And I have a friend from school, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, but her last name, it's like half of her mum's last name and half of her dad's last name. So she has like an entirely new made up name. And they were like, neither of us want to give up our name, so we're just going to make a new one for you. And like, yes,
Yeah.
people don't automatically know that you're our child, but here you go, this is your name. And I remember her telling me that and me just being like, that's such, like, you know, like you were saying to him, like finding a new way around it and going, you know, we're not quite sure we want to just do the automatic thing. And I thought that was a really cool way of her parents being like, here you go, you're both of us.
Obviously, Charlotte, you've missed out on being Charlotte Loris.
I know. We could have been Loris, we could have been Nada, we could have done all sorts of fun stuff. Like, it's just, I think what this is a really interesting example of, though, is what we're saying of, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking somebody's name, but what seems to matter is the motive behind it, right? Is that somebody telling you have to have their name and that you are now theirs and you're part of it. Whereas what Alex and I were doing, and it seems like you were doing, Tim, is going, well, we want to be a unit. We want to do something that shows that we are a family. There's something very beautiful about wherever I am in the world, people can connect us through our name. They know that we're together, right? I've got friends who have done a kind of portmanteau name, and it's really nice. There's something very beautiful about that. Phenomenologically, it looks sort of the same as somebody just taking their husband's name. But that motivation really matters. And so it's a good example of what we're talking about, which is like, are we against marriage? Do we think that the Bible has nothing to say? No. But the difference between this is a rule you follow and this is an ethic you apply is quite big. It might look the same out in the world, but actually that small shift is a large one. That it's a big thing to cross. And the ethic behind something really does matter for me. It's important.
So coming up as well, we also have a bonus episode with Lauren Jackson, who is a childhood friend of Rachel's, who is now also a sex educator. So, Rachel, what did we talk about?
It's a good question. Me and Lauren were having like lunch with my auntie and uncle afterwards, and I was like, oh, this is my friend Lauren. She's a sex educator. And my uncle, God bless him, was like, she's a what? And I was like, oh, no, she teaches sex education in school. And he was like, oh, yeah, okay, sex educator sounds like something very different. But yeah, no, it was cool. It was the first time that I got to sort of take the reins a little bit, which was fun. So yeah, Lauren teaches sex education under the sexual health service in schools. And we as a collective group thought it would be really helpful to get some of her insight basically and talk about kind of what young people care about when they talk about sex and what they know and what they don't know and kind of what the kind of current attitudes on the ground are in terms of sex at the minute. We also talked about kind of our histories as like two young people that went to the same youth group and kind of what we had been told and what we've learnt since then, and also like how we would approach, or how she specifically would approach working with Christian young people when talking to them about sex. And also I think for us it was just a lot of our kind of missteps potentially when it comes to sex is that we just weren't educated enough because you know, of the state of the sex education system when we were in school, but also because in some part because we've grown up in church. And we talked a little bit about that debate of like, well, if you talk about it, are you encouraging them to do it and how does that work, and hitting the notes really of what we think is important and kind of the knowledge that we don't have that she does have.
Wonderful.
So yeah,
I'm very excited about it.
me too, I'm excited.
I haven't heard it, so I'm excited.
Yeah, I could say that it was great. And I know there've been a lot of questions from lots of people about how to start approaching this kind of topic with young people.
Yeah, and we definitely talk about that too.
Yeah, and I think Lauren's insights are really, really valuable. It's such a different landscape than it was when I was young, but I think it's been really helpful to just reappraise what I was taught and how I was taught in light of someone who's kind of at the coalface. So looking forward to getting that out. That'll be out in the next couple of weeks. So buckle up. Make sure you subscribe so that you get notified of that immediately. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. Episodes are released every other Monday, and the next episode in the series is on Monday, 24th of November. Simon picks up where Charlotte left off to explore the evolution of Christian marriage to its present-day context. If you can't wait until then, our interview with sex educator Lauren Jackson will be released on Monday, 17th of November. Lastly, a reminder, if you'd like to support the project, make sure you share it with your friends, family, or any other relatives you're feeling guilty about having lost touch with and need a handy pretext to reach out. As always, you can patronise us by subscribing to agodwecouldbelievin.substack.com. Here you'll also receive bonus episodes and regular reflections from Simon and the team right to your inbox. We will see you again very soon.